Good morning again. I'm going to ask all of you, you're young and for many of you, this is your first higher education venture, but hold on to everything. Don't try not to throw away anything that you think is important or anything that you have that could be considered crucial to your life or to the lives of those who surround you and or who have surrounded you. Old family Bibles and old family artifacts are very important because that's a part of your personal history. I'm saying all that because I have in my hand a letter that I'm going to share with you. Every now and then I kind of, if I can get in it, go into my study at home and go through stuff, and I got stuff from way, way back. I found this letter. Chock full of Nuts is a major coffee company. Mm-hmm. This letter is dated, I don't know how I got it, but it's authentic. It's dated, has a stamp on it, 2 stamps at the bottom, May 26, 1958, May 14th, 1958. The letter is dated May 13th, 1958, and it's addressed to President of the United States, who at that time was General Dwight Eisenhower, who was the overwhelming hero of World War II, as I'm sure you know. But I want to read this to you. My dear Mr. President, I was sitting in the audience at the summit meeting of Negro leaders yesterday when you said we must have patience. On hearing you say this, I felt like standing up and saying, oh no, not again. I respectfully remind you, sir, that we have been the most patient of all people. When you said we must have self-respect, I wondered how we could have self-respect and remain patient considering the treatment accorded us through the years. 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we are entitled to as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressively goals which all other Americans achieved over 150 years ago. As the chief executive of our nation, I respectfully suggest that you unwittingly crush the spirit of freedom in Negroes by constantly urging forbearance and give hope to those pro-segregation leaders like Governor Faubus, Arkansas, who would take from us even those freedoms we now enjoy. Here he's speaking of Governor Faubus's attempt to not integrate the public schools of the state of Arkansas. That led to a major confrontation in Little Rock in the fall of 1957. Your own experience with Governor Faubus is proof enough that forbearance and not eventual integration is the goal the pro-segregation leaders seek. In my view, an unequivocal statement backed up by action, such as you demonstrated you could take last fall in dealing with Governor Faubus, if it became necessary, will let it be known that America is determined to provide in the near future for Negroes the freedoms we are entitled to under the Constitution. Now listen to this. Respectfully yours, Jackie Robinson, the first black baseball player in the major leagues. This was dated, and Jackie Robinson was named, assistant president of Chock full of Nuts in 1958 after he resigned from the Dodgers after they were taken out of Brooklyn and moved to Los Angeles. He refused to go and he just dropped out. but Jackie Robinson. I don't know where I got this from. This is the authentic.
Yeah. How do you casually have a letter to Dwight D. Eisenhower from Jackie Robinson? Like, how does that casually fall upon you?
Yes, isn't that something?
From 1958.
But this, I suppose it's been lost to history. By the way, when I started really drinking coffee a lot, I switched automatically to chocolate. It's a good coffee though. This is it. I don't know where I got this from. You know, I think I buy so many books. I go to old bookstores that sell old books, and I'm sure this was in one of the books. I found so many books. I paid 50 cents in a socialist bookstore for Reinhold Niebuhr's classic book, Moral Man in a Moral Society, which was written in 1933, and it is there's an autograph, handwritten autograph of him, whoever bought the book. He signed it all. Always Reinhold Niebuhr. And I said, wow. And I told somebody that recently, and they said, man, you're sitting on a gold mine. I said, well, I paid 50 cents for it. 50 cents. And now you can't buy that book under $100 anywhere. It's on, what's that thing on the online?
Amazon?
What?
Amazon?
Amazon. Amazon has it, but you have to pay about $150 for it. I bought it for 50 cents. It's hard bound. I bring it into the show. You don't know how many professors have asked, can I borrow the book? I said, no. Yes, you can. You cut off your leg and leave it with you. No way am I getting rid of that. If you would sign that, please. All right, let's get going for today. We're talking about migration. We're going to be in and out of the international immigration situation. Thank you. But I want to talk now about the largest in-house, internal migration that we have on record. Some of us might raise the question, why are there so many black people living in the urban north, large populations, Detroit, Philadelphia, the various boroughs of New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Columbus, where I'm from, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Why are these cities and the urban areas of these cities so dark in their population? Well, it might surprise you to know that at the turn of the 20th century, in the year 1900, over 80% of all black people in the United States lived in the South. And the majority of that number lived in the rural South, because black farmers made up 43% of all of the farmlands. And those farmlands are transferred from the hands of slaveholders to those who worked the land, black people. So when they were set free, part of the Reconstruction was that the federal government took all of that land, confiscated it from white Southerners who were pro-slavery, and they gave the land to black people. And black people then became owners of the land. And from that period, 1900 till right after the World War I, let's say 1920, a large segment of the southern farmland was in the hands of blacks. It started drifting away after that. Now, blacks only own 6% of all of the farmlands in the United States. 6%. That's a tragically low number that they've sold off, died off, and sons and daughters of black Southerners did not want to live under the same kind of oppression that their parents did. So many of them left before 1950, 1960, abandoned, sold whatever land they had. They had no interest in being farmers, had no interest in working the land, and they moved north to escape the difficulties that they were under in the South. But we're going to talk about that for a bit. Now, the largest migratory event in the history of the United States occurred between 1913 In 1920, that's not a very long time, but enough for approximately 3.5 million black people, 3.5 million, to leave the South and move mostly to the urban north. And though they had been consistently shifting south to north since the 1870s, the mass movement, which began in 1913, 1914, was to become so immense as to be called by social historians as you've heard this statement of this term, I'm sure, the Great Migration. The Great Migration developed at a period of intense social change in the United States. We talked about that at length on the last time we were here. And this change was not only being felt in the United States, but throughout the world. The First World War was into its preliminary stages in Europe. And the restlessness in Tsarist Russia and I think that Anna gave a statement about her ancestry, part of whom came from Russia during this period. And this restlessness in Russia was due to the revolutionary consciousness of the peasants, and that would soon erupt into what we call capital B, Bolshevism. That was a revolution in Russia that turned the entire Russian nation into a people's republic, so to speak, and it became it would become subsequently the Soviet Union. Now, the social philosophy of communism was not really strongly entrenched yet, but it was causing a great deal of anxiety worldwide. That would be one of the movements that would stem itself out of Marxism and out of Bolshevism. Well, I know I'm probably saying things you haven't studied yet, but continue to take history courses. You have some good professors who are very knowledgeable about this period of time. Now, in America, though, the social frictions that arose from massive European immigration policies were agitating strife between whites and blacks in the North. While in the South, from the 1890s to the close of 1915, over 4,000 African Americans, including women and youth, would be wantonly executed by white lynch mobs. Black reaction to the brutalities practiced against them, coupled with the fantasized concepts of the North, precipitated the Great Migration. As powerless, landless, jobless, and impoverished black people sought a better life for their children and for themselves. Historians make a grave mistake by not connecting the Great Migration with all the other persecutions that were going on as a result of immigration policies. That's why we're looking at this, because that's the number one issue in American social and political elements today. But it should be observed that a general feeling of racial and religious intolerance gripped the United States on the eve of the First World War. Again, Jews and Catholics remained constant targets of white hate groups. As following the year 1915, membership in the Ku Klux Klan would rise astronomically, in part due to a remarkable racist movie produced by W.D. Griffith that was called Birth of a Nation, the same title given to a recent movie that deals with racial difficulties. But the original, W.D. Griffith, the year 1915, Birth of a Nation, was responsible for an incredible rise in membership of the Ku Klux Klan. Birth of a Nation was a vilification of the Reconstruction era. And it typified black men as corrupt, ignorant, as rapists, and as a deadly force to the suprematist values of the white South. The KKK and other white xenophobic organizations constantly described Catholics as foreigners, particularly those who were Italian and Irish. And by the time the war would be entered into by America, German American communities and German immigrants became objects of violence by irrational white patriotic mobs. And this was strange because the United States really didn't get into the war until 1917, and a year and a half later was over, World War I. My hometown, we had before I was born, there was a park called Schiller Park, it's German, Schiller. And when World War I became notarized, and the Germans were fighting against Britain and France, even before the United States got into it on the German and British side, a white mob terrorized the German community in Columbus and destroyed Schiller Park. Destroyed it. Now, after people have let rationality overcome irrationality on these things, after I left Columbus in the 1960s, they had redone that park, and it's now called German Village. So they've reincorporated it as and a lot of Germans, that's where they habitate. That's where they are. Lutheran Church is very strong there. And that community is growing, so it's now German Village. You don't have to be German to live there, but it would help. Now, during the general 6-year period of internal migration activity, the deep southern states lost the highest numbers of black people despite intensive pressure on the part of white labor against them leaving. The whites in power did not want the blacks to leave. That's obvious. Now, these fleeing refugees were mostly rural worker families from the following states: Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and South Carolina. These were states where racial hatred was most oppressive, expressive, and violent. But these states were to lose thousands of whole black families, while other southern states, such as Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky, would lose less. Florida, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware lost even less of its black populations, while Texas, Oklahoma, and the remaining Jim Crow states of the Southwest were not heavily impacted by the migration, but they would be during World War II once the shipyards began to open in California, but not at this point. It is interesting that Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland, though identified as southern cities, actually became a destination for many black families during the Great Migration. Now, as was the case earlier, the white South did not favor black workers, especially those from rural areas leaving the South, due to the poor wage system that oppressed black workers and that destituted their families. And because of the popularity of neo-slavery sharecropping that kept black workers in economic bondage and that worked favorably for white landowners, white resistance against the Great Migration was quite strong. The prison system in the South, through a vicious convict lease program, provided valuable free labor for the internal improvements of the South. That would be our first example of kickbacks. And that practice of leasing convicts to do work that should be done by engineering forces, this would not go away, and it would not go untouched by the effects of the mass migration of black people out of the South, because they would arrest black men on petty trespasses, place them into prison, and then lease them out to build bridges and dams and things of that nature. And the money that they would get to do this from the federal government would then be given to private contractors, which was illegal, but which everybody kept their mouths closed. Now, it is part of the record of American history that white people utilized many methods to maintain black people in the South. A large number of blacks in the South were very poor, desperate, and the severity placed on them and their lives as a result of the brutal nature of white Southern racism made life for many of them unbearable. Racism carried with it a ruthlessness which permeated the whole of Southern life and beyond. With the exception of the church, school, and loving families, blacks found little comfort in anything else. So once the trek from south to north would begin, it was predictable that large numbers of black people would participate. Now, with the fires of white supremacy burning around it, the black church yet sought to comfort its people. Against overwhelming odds, the church preached redemption, while at the same time advocating morals, education, family values, and social principles which have died hard over the years. Those aren't necessarily part of the mores of northern black Christians, but still in the South, many of these principles abide. The black churches were targeted, they were burned, and some destroyed. That's a common thing. the civil rights movement, because of the fact that black churches, some white churches, Jewish synagogues were meeting points where strategies were discussed, especially for voting. Many of those churches and religious institutions were burned to the ground, destroyed, wiped out, because they were defiant symbols of opposition to segregation. There were instances which witnessed the flogging and killing of black religious leaders who were leaders in the protest moments against white rule and law. And this heroic drama of the black church has mostly been lost to history. Nobody talks about it, nobody writes about it. Now, certainly the clearest reason for black people to leave the South at that period was the threat of danger and death imposed on them by white mob terrorism. Even where terrorism was a lesser factor, the stark reality of inopportunity, perpetuated by a staunch segregationist system and social order, gave little hope to black people without the collective means to survive psychologically within that type of environment. I would not have been able to do it. I could not have really survived within that. But there were millions of black people who did. And they survived mostly because of their faith. But while we had many that survived, we had many that did not survive. Additionally, white law enforcement elements were candidly brutal. Black lives did not matter. Black life was cheap, and young black men were killed with impunity by the law keepers. But there were other important things to consider related to race, which were also precipitative as well as others, while not directly related to race, antagonism. But nonetheless, they were instrumental to this whole drama. Now, it can be effectively argued that the collapse of the system known as populism played a part early on, because it laid the structure for much of the poverty that would be later faced by what we call the black farmer worker. That's one farmer dash worker. Because the death of what we describe as populism sped the return of state political power of white supremacists. Now, there's a group of white supremacists who came out of this period known as the Bourbons. Capital B is spelled the same way as the alcoholic beverage, bourbon. B-O-U-R-B-O-N. Now, the Bourbons effectively employed illegal tactics to deprive black people of their lands, their properties, and their voting rights. That'll make them think we're involved in something secret. That'll get more people in their turn. Don't let me go too far now that you're asking questions.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Beg pardon?
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Sure. The Bourbons would be very effective in employing illegal tactics to deprive black people of their lands, their properties, and their voting rights. Now with the end of populism also came an end to the group, this is a capital CFA, the Colored Farmers Alliance. This was a very important group because it had a collaborative link to white farmers. That we'll refer to it as the CFA. And once the CFA was weakened and dispersed, there was no way for the black farmer worker to survive. Not only the threats coming from white encroachment, but also the destructive economic assaults of nature. Now we talked about the potato famine in Ireland that occurred in the 1840s that led to millions of Irish people leaving Ireland and coming to the United States to try to start all over again. Well, the United States had its own economic assaults as well. And one of the things that, we talked about Steinbeck's two books, Grapes of Wrath and Tobacco Road, that really depicts the plight of the white farmer in Oklahoma, most particularly, but in Oklahoma and Texas. But during the early 1900s, the crippling effects of the boll weevil insect, it was a beetle actually, called the boll weevil, B-O-L-L, and then weevil, W-E-E-V-I-L. Note the E-V-I-L on that, in that last term, boll weevil. But this insect was death to cotton. It destroyed much of the economy of the South because it would eat cottonseed and other crops. And that effect of the boll weevil was disastrous. This beetle was responsible for millions of dollars of losses as it devoured acres of cotton, cotton seed, tobacco leaf, and other critical yields. The economic losses attendant to the boll weevil invasions was so staggering that thousands of people, black and white, lost everything they had. So, many African Americans, directly affected by the ravages of the boll weevil, joined other new exodusters, that's what they were called, and they hit the road. Nothing left. By the year 1916, and notably following the death of Booker T. Washington 1 year earlier, who was the most important African American possibly in history, we don't know. The story's not quite complete with that yet, but he was extremely important, Booker T. Washington. Certainly no one more influential than Booker T. Washington. But black migration out of the South increased after his death because Washington, who had dramatically urged complete geographical loyalty by Southern whites, was no longer around to exert that type of influence. Washington preached that black people needed to stay in the South. His death also served to remind blacks in Alabama that their chief defender, Washington, had been taken away and that they were, because of his death, leaderless and therefore vulnerable. Thus, it was in their best interest to retreat. Also, by 1916, European immigration into the United States had been sharply reduced as a result of limiting entry into the country, Europeans, who might be under the influence of a foreign government. No proof, but they'll do it anyway. Absolutely. Germans. Now this decrease had gone from 1,200,000 European refugees in 1 year, 1914, to only 110,000, 1915, or 1916, 17, and 18. That's all that came into the country during those 3 years from Europe, 110,000. And this was thought, again, a necessary precaution as America had begun to mobilize for the war that had already begun in most of Europe, started in Europe in 1914. Now, because of the limited number of European immigrant laborers, Northern industrialists began to beckon to the black labor population of the South and subsequently induced high numbers of black men to temporarily leave their families to try their luck working in the northern factories. Boom, up they came. Oh, let me go back and give you a little personal history of myself, my family. The maternal side of my family came from Tennessee. And the paternal side of my family came from Alabama. So my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother migrated from Tennessee to Columbus, and my father and his mother, my grandmother, migrated from Alabama to, first of all, Kentucky, and then across the river to Cincinnati, where my father was raised. Now, I never knew my paternal grandfather because he died before I was born, but he was a full-blooded Blackfoot Indian, and he was a pilot, a boat pilot on the Ohio River between Kentucky and Cincinnati. I guess that's how my grandmother, after he died, zeroed in on Cincinnati. But my father was an only child, believe it or not. My mother was an only child. And my two sisters and I grew up in Ohio. We were the only kids on the block with no cousins. All the rest of them had 50, this is a term from the hood, 50-11. It means a whole lot. They had 50-11 cousins. We didn't have one. So we had to invent people. You're my cousin. This is cousin Jessica. She's visiting us from New York. Not New York, New York. And that's the way that went. But we didn't have anybody. But nonetheless, that's where all of my peers, every one of them from elementary school when we were little kids, their parents came from the South. So the northern communities were just developing very, very rapidly from a somewhat of a northern perception among black people to a southern one. And my grandparents, my grandfather, I think after he got here, I don't know, I don't know that history, I wish I did, but he was a master tailor. He worked for another concern, but people would men used to bring their suits to him, because they knew, to his company. They knew he worked there because he was in high demand. He could have easily gone into business for himself as a tailor, but he never did. But anyway, that's my background. So I have both Alabama blood and Tennessee blood, a little bit of Indian blood working in me. But all of us had that. Now, this is what would happen when European immigration slowed and it was necessary to work these factories. White businessmen really began to beckon, as I mentioned a moment ago, to the South for black workers, black men particularly, to come up. At times, though, white businessmen would charter whole trains in order to entice and transport black men into the North. More often than not, the men would be cramped into freight cars for the 2 or 3 days rail journey. But of course, the promises of high wages, low rents, social and educational opportunities made these journeys of the New Middle Passage, I call it, easy enough to bear as for them freedom they thought neared. Now, once America's involvement in World War I, blacks would find it rather easy to obtain employment in the North, working in war factories, building ships, aircraft, and other instruments of human destruction. Now, white profit makers are not the only ones urging blacks to flee the terrorism of the South. Black people already in the North played a major piece in encouraging Southern blacks to leave their homes and seek freedom in the North. Many African Americans were enthralled at the news coming from other families and friends who had made it to the North, telling in exaggerated tones, note that, exaggerated, of non-segregated living patterns, of good schools, equal opportunities, and social advantages. Somebody wrote a book, I've forgotten who it was, but he had copies of letters in the book of black people who had made it, that transition from the South to the North, and were sending letters to the South to families, encouraging them, because pack up and leave, come on. Because they were beckoning people to come to the North. But again, those were very exaggerated terms. But this whole vision of full employment, educational benefits for their children, convinced many that the Great Migration was their golden opportunity to leave the dangers of the South behind. Now, blacks in the South, who perhaps seldom entertained such thoughts for themselves, certainly did for their children, and many, for the sole sake of their children, found themselves on the dusty trail to the North with a guitar in one hand and a Bible in the other. Here they come. Now, black churches in the North, black businesses, black newspapers stoutly advocated migration. Well, much of it, sure, I'm sure a lot of it dealt with true feelings of fraternalism. But when I say churches, businesses, and newspapers, and later funeral homes, that's a major economic profit for blacks who were engaged in these businesses, because now you're getting tons of people into these areas that will, since they can't take part in white movements such as this, they automatically will take their businesses and their money to these people. Now, we had one black newspaper that was extremely effective during this time. It was very influential, and it was called the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender newspaper, black newspaper, under the leadership of its owner and a refugee himself from the racial horrors of Georgia, a man whose name was Robert S. Bennett. That S stands for Senstack. Robert Senstack Abbott. I'm sorry, I said Bennett Abbott. A-B-B-O-T-T. But his newspaper, The Defender, was critical in attracting Southern blacks to one destination, Chicago. Abbott, who as a youth had fled to Chicago, worked his way through college, Northwestern University, who had earned a degree in journalism, so he drowned the South with copies of The Defender, and in glaring red headlines urged black people to leave the tyranny of the South. Come to Chicago. That's the only city he indicated. Come to Chicago, where they could be housed, they could be fed, they'd be cared for by humane people. Well, Abbott had a lot of influence with the white community, white religious institutions. The newly established Urban League, National Urban League, had an office in Chicago. And he really did do his best to see that that promise would be fulfilled, because black people piled on trains, buses, trucks, any way they could get up here or to Chicago. And his position was shared in part by the growing northern black business communities for an increase in black people would basically assure an increase in their own revenue. We talked about that. Now, not all black people, though, already comfortable and entrenched in the North, were to welcome the new arrivals. It wasn't carte blanche, no. You had some black people who said, ooh. You have black people today, someone say, ooh. Because the class factor has returned. The factors of racism, unemployment, poverty, hunger, and law enforcement brutality in the South, coupled with the expectations of education, social and work opportunities, stimulated black people to look to the North as a kind of promised land. And while untold numbers took advantage of the new move to improve their conditions, for many, their northern pursuit would not hold much promise and would become an extension of the nightmares they experienced in the South. So what I want to do now, I want to talk about some of the tragedies that would overwhelm black people, some of them, and they were not able to deal with them. But first I want to look at the cities that attracted most of the black people who were part of the Great Migration from this period up to 1920. Questions now? Okay. The destinations chosen by those dusty refugees were varied, with earlier departed family or friends assisting them to come to where they were. So if I had members of my family who had made it safely to Cleveland, they would send letters back home or messages, come to Cleveland. Many of the black spirituals that many of us have heard, whether we sing them or not, we hear them because they're very popular. While heaven, salvation is thought to be the main objective of these songs, really wasn't. Really weren't. Come and go with me. Come and go with me. Come and go with me to the promised land. They talk about going north. Talk about the underground, this is from slavery, the Underground Railroad. Steal away to Jesus, steal away. Oh Lord, the trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay here. They're not about dying. They're talking about they don't have long to stay in slavery. They're going to get away. So many of the, if we really decipher these songs, they were code messages that were sung on plantations to slaves, giving them an impetus and the effectiveness, the courage to leave. Wonder how long that train been gone. Talking about the Underground Railroad now. Wonder how long that train been gone. That evening train, they talk about the evening train. Then they talk about the morning train. When they say that, that means that that's when they're going to take off. They're going to join that stream of people who are trying to get north. So those are re-included in the period of the Great Migration. So we hear songs talking about the promised land or this, that, and the other that depict a better place to live and to be. They were talking about going north. Although the heaven thing is legitimate, but for the most part, it meant escaping whatever environment that they were in. Now, whatever other period of time was this, or these songs brought in, that really started white people singing them a lot? What period? Your parents' period. When your parents were sitting around the table at University of Rochester, what was happening? What was going on in this country? Civil rights movement. Yes. Yes. Before I be a slave, I'll go down in my grave and be with my Lord to be free. That was a song and that song, what is it? It's an old white Methodist hymn. I'll wear my crown. I will wear a crown. Same tune. I will wear a crown song, that's a white song. It's a white Methodist song. But the civil rights movement just changed the words, that's all. We will overcome. Now that's the standard hymn of the civil rights movement. We will overcome. They didn't change too many words because the words is a 4-stanza hymn of the white church. I will wear a crown. And they just changed that to we will be free. Someday, deep in my heart. That was an original. I still believe I'll wear a crown someday. That's what white people were singing in churches. They just incorporated it into the civil rights movement, and then it became the standard piece of music, the key signature for civil rights music. Although I prefer Peter, Paul, and Mary. You remember Peter, Paul, and Mary? Y'all know who Peter, Paul, and Mary? What? Hooray! Hooray! I told my wife the other day, I said, I feel so irrelevant. I mentioned Anthony Quinn, and nobody had ever heard of him. The poor guy just died 5 years ago. One of the greatest actors of American cinema. Yeah, but Peter, Paul, and Mary, if I had a hammer, oh, that was a great song. I'd hammer out freedom for my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Those were 3 young white people, Peter, Paul, and Mary, who were enigmatic within the civil rights movement. They sung music, they played music that really depicted the struggle for human justice. And those are great days, though. I reflect on them. I really do. Great, great days. But nonetheless, let's get back to this now. The destination, the destinations chosen, these were the major cities. The one major city was New York City, and this would include Brooklyn, and all of those boroughs. And a large number of black people from this period went to the various string of Long Island communities. But for the most part, New York City, when we think of New York City, we think of Harlem. But also Brooklyn. In our area, Buffalo. Buffalo had steel mills and railroads, a very productive railroad system, Buffalo. Newark, New Jersey, Camden, New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey, and Jersey City. I think 2 of them ended up Hoboken, maybe 2. Philadelphia was a major target, as was Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh. Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Toledo, Akron, Youngstown, and Cleveland, Ohio, believe it or not. All of those areas, those cities, because they had the kind of work opportunities that drew a lot of men particularly to them. Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Toledo, Akron, Youngstown, and Cleveland. Gary, Fort Wayne, and Indianapolis, Indiana. Michael Jackson's family, his ancestry moved from the south to Gary, Indiana. That's where he was born. Black people also trained in on St. Louis, East St. Louis, Kansas City, Missouri, and specifically Chicago and Detroit. The 2 biggest areas from the jump were Chicago and New York City, but New York City, it must be understood that you're talking about all of these boroughs and other areas. But Chicago and Detroit being single cities, but also being industrial giants, attracted a lot of men. Now, smaller numbers were attracted to Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Boston,
smaller numbers, Hartford, Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island, and other smaller venues including Chester, Pennsylvania, Flint, Michigan. Now, few black people are recorded as having migrated to the West Coast during this time. But wherever jobs were believed to be more likely, this determined migrant stream became a part. There were hardly any black people living in Rochester during that time, very, very few. Barely 1,000, though this was the home for many years of Frederick Douglass and others, but Rochester never did become a part of the immigration, the European immigration, yes, that helped develop Rochester. But black people never really zeroed in on Rochester until the 1960s. And then it was migrant labor, and these people were not transitioning here. They were coming here, working, and then going back. They were seasonal workers, pickers. And then around 1960 or so, when Xerox Corporation was called something else, and I can't remember. I've been told it was called something else. And Eastman Kodak, when many of the people who were coming up as migrant workers heard of these places, they were encouraged to apply for jobs, and that's what started the trek, really. So that by 1960, you had something like 15,000 black people between Wayne County and Monroe County living in the area. But the black community then began to grow because poor farmers and workers, migrant workers, began to come to Rochester, and then they had to determine the place where they were going to stay. So the first place was the third ward. The second place was the 7th ward. And it's the 7th ward now that has the greatest level of poverty in Rochester, if you want to go by cities, according to the new initiative that was formed, anti-poverty, a year and a half ago.
I have a question.
When I came to Rochester to go to graduate school in 1966, there were approximately, show you how fast it grew, there were approximately 15,000 black people here. Now they say, this is what they say, now they say in Rochester alone you have between 30 and 35,000 black people. You have between 20 and 25,000 Latino or Hispanic people. And then that's looked at nationwide. You say nationwide you have 22 million black people, but that's not correct. You have more than that. That was a number given that would just remain static. 22 million, 22 million, 22 million. We got 22 million black people living in Harlem, so you know that's not right. 22 million. But there are actually closer to 40 million black people now living in the United States. That is decreasing, or the forecast is for the black population to decrease, the Latino population to grow, so that in the course of 50 or 60 years, the majority population in the United States of America will be various forms of Spanish-speaking adherents, Mexicans, people from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, other places will be the major lingual ethnic group or groups in the United States. I don't think so. I really don't think so. And a lot of demographers do not think so. I think that's more of an alarm, a fear that they're throwing out. I don't think that's so. But I do know that numbers of black people are decreasing because for the first time in history, over the last, let's say, 20 years, more black families are practicing birth control. Abortion is at its highest level among poor black women. And with racial integration, quote, integration, unquote, leading to many interracial marriages with the children not wishing to be classified as black. The numbers of black people statistically suffering a major drop in terms of numbers. So, you know, we look at all that in terms of what's ahead for African Americans. Yes?
I was just curious, where, like, you said the 7th Ward is like,
Oh, the 7th Ward,
like where
thank
is
you.
that?
7th Ward is that area around Joseph Avenue.
Oh,
Anything well back in there, or goes from you know where the old Amtrak station used to be in Monroe? It goes starting there where they had that overpass, all the way back to Norton Street. That and sections to the left and right of it, that is called the 7th Ward. That's where the what the people here call riots, really were uprisings. That's where they were precipitated in 1964, and that is the largest area of black and Hispanic residency in the area. 3rd Ward has gone through some major renovations. 3rd Ward is right around here, back over from behind the university, off of Brooks Avenue, streets like Wellington, streets like Arnett Boulevard. All that's part of the 3rd Ward. And the 3rd Ward, like the 19th Ward back in that area, the 3rd Ward is the other end of the 19th Ward. The 19th Ward was basically predominantly white. Still a large number of white families in that area, but black people with the economic means began to move into the 19th Ward from the 3rd Ward. 3rd Ward saw a lot of gentrification, such as, what's the term? Cornhill. That's the major one. That used to be moderately poor, but upward moving poor black people between middle class.
Adult code team, call unit 63400. Adult code team, call unit 63400.
Between those levels of economic classification, poor and middle class are not too poor, but they own their homes and working poor. But the regentrification is called, they're encouraged to sell their homes, and now that area is really very, very attractive, very expensive, and the majority of homeowners over there now, even though they're townhouses, are young white people. It was made as a yuppie attraction, and it's worked. And that took care of the 3rd Ward. 7th Ward, nobody wants to move there. 7th Ward, that's your highest crime area. 7th Ward is where your worst public schools are located. 7th Ward is where everything seems to be falling apart. So unless they really do something very strong to deal with the fragmentation that has occurred in the 7th Ward, there'll be no interruption of the poverty cycle around here. None whatsoever. The family structure is very weak over there. Speaking of the black family structure, there's some poor white families over there too that are suffering the same way, that have the same problems, but they're not visible. The media does not make white suffering visible, only non-white suffering. But I've said this from the first day of class. If you go to rural America, you'll find the worst cases of poverty being suffered by poor white people. They have absolutely nothing. They have no programs. They have nothing. They have children. They have the school for those poor children are just absolutely atrocious. So much so that the American, what they call it, the Internal Peace Corps, what's it called? Come on. VISTA, the VISTA program. It encouraged young people with college degrees to commit themselves to these areas for 5 years, teaching the children this, that, and the other. It's horrible. That's who Michael Harrington, who was a socialist, in his book, The Other America, Poverty in America, Poverty in America, zeroed in on white rural families. When he came to Congress and he spoke in 1962 about the number of children facing hunger and dying, even though he included all children, he specifically targeted or tried to make Congress understand that this was something that affected all children in America. And only one congressman was really strongly gracious to Michael Harrington's words, and that was the future president of the United States within 2 years of that time, Lyndon B. Johnson, who grew up as a privileged young white man in Texas, educated parents. He studied education. First school that they assigned him to was a poor white school in the rural area, and it affected him so bad he left. And he never forgot that experience. And when Michael Harrington came and pleaded with Congress to put money into programs that would help alleviate these terrible situations, Lyndon Johnson was so impressed that he started, when he became president, the war on poverty. And that man we had here, Dr. Aaron Wicks at ABC, he represented the first major anti-poverty program started by the government that is still in operation today. So poverty is a mess. And he reflected on a little bit of it from being not only in Monroe County, but he named the counties around that are being served. It's terrible, terrible. Can we imagine going to bed hungry and not knowing if we're going to eat the next day? There's how many children do that. You know, people just close their eyes. I don't see it, can't hear it, I'm never talking. I don't know it exists. I don't want to know it exists. It's terrible. I was looking at the paper. Let's waste of time to stop anyway. Let's stop right there for that one. Where do we end up? Oh, the cities, right? Okay, we'll pick that up. I was looking at the paper today, and in Syria, there was a chemical, that's poison gas, that was distributed by terrible people. Prime victims of this thing have been children. Children have died, and children have been. Ooh. Yeah, we have to look at that. World War I, World War II, terrible death statistics, but those terrible death statistics were not the men who died fighting, but the majority were innocent people who were bombed to death, shot to death, they were in the way, they were killed. Look at the numbers of children from World War I, World War II, the various Far Eastern conflicts that this country has imposed itself. Numbers of children. Now, if you are a religious person, if you believe in God, if you believe in eternal justice, somebody's going to have to speak to that. God, this thing of wiping out children is something just, no, I'm not going to war because I'm in a position where I'm going to kill some innocent children. I don't want to do it. This, and I'll let you go, I promise. During World War II, when it was determined that they were going to drop the atom bombs on Japan, they wanted to soften Nagasaki and all of the major Japanese cities, Yokohama, Tokyo, that they were thinking about dropping, and Tokyo would have been the third city. But they wanted to soften them by dropping these incendiary bombs. And they ordered 8th Air Force, the commander of the 8th Air Force, to fly the B-29s over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Yokohama and drop incendiary bombs. But the commander of the 8th Air Force, and I can't remember his name, I don't know his name. I heard this story from Dan Rather. Dan Rather is a retired newsman, and he's totally, absolutely legitimate. If he said it, it happened. But he said it, that once gotten the report to do it, he refused. He said, and he questioned the order. He said, there are no defense plants there. There are no military activity there. Those two cities are full of women and children. We can't kill them like this. And they ordered, he refused the third time, and they arrested him. And then his second in command refused to do it, and they arrested him, and they gave them life for hard labor. Life at hard labor in Kansas, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Curtis LeMay, who was over all of them, then decided he would lead the attack. And then he made it plain that these B-29s in August of 1945 not only would drop these incendiary bombs to lighten up soften up these cities, but to drop these bombs. And they did. And in both cities, over 100,000 people were cremated. A lot of children, man. You think about that. We got to think about that. That's what makes war so horrible. Horrible. It's great for bonding, but beyond that, I don't know what its use is. You kill people. You kill people. I was behind this guy after the Korean War ended. We were both in line for a job, and we were going to get hired because we were veterans. There was a government installation in Columbus. I remember asking the lady at the table, asking him, "Did you have to learn any skills while you were in the Army? Did you learn anything?" He said, "Oh, yes." And she said, "Well, what?" She was going to write it down. And he said, "I learned how to kill people." Oh. And he was angry, and that's what he did. And he regretted it. And we all went through that kind of metamorphosis from our home training, from our moral training, from our spiritual training, to being monsters. We got a gun, got a bayonet, kill people. That's all you go to the Army, that's all you go to the military for, to learn how to kill people. Whatever purpose, what other purpose is it? Why did they make guns? To kill things. Animals and people. That's our only use. That's our only use. So, we're living in a terrible situation right now. And this whole thing of killing, destroying human life, destroying the lives of children, doesn't radiate to most people. But y'all, it has to. Y'all young. You're young. You can change this world. Don't become part of it. Kick against it. Kick against it. Make some changes. Got to. Make things better for kids. Whew. See you, my brother. Everybody sign my paper?
This weekend. So I'm going to be Quidditch.
What's that?
Have you ever read Harry Potter or seen the movies?
Well, I've seen excerpts from it.
Okay, you know the sport where they're flying on brooms?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't fly, but we play that.
I was going to say witches.
Yeah. No, it's kind of like rugby with all the tackling and stuff.
Oh.
But, we have our national tournament, like championship, in Florida this weekend. And so we're not going to get back until like...
University of Rochester? Oh.
Yeah.
Should be on the sports page. I haven't seen it on the sports page.
We'll see. There might be some sort of like information coming out like after this weekend because this is like the biggest national tournament.
If you win, what's next? That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. We went 2 years ago and got top 10 in the nation.
No kidding.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah.
All right. Now, is there a men's team too?
No, it's a mixed gender team. So like I'll be tackling guys and we're like this video and they'll be like tackling me back.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, just wanted you to know that I won't be here.
All right. Good. Thank you.
Thanks.
How you doing, Doctor?
Good. How are you?
I think I'll make it. I think I'll make it.